The moment the string quartet stopped playing, I knew my daughter's wedding was over. The celebration I had funded with $150,000 of my life's work had just ended, at least for me. But for my new son-in-law, the real bill was about to come due. You might think a father would be heartbroken in that moment, and a part of me was. But what came after the pain was something colder, something much more calculated. It all started when I overheard him call me a beggar to his groomsmen, laughing as he sipped champagne. He saw my calloused hands and simple dark suit and judged my entire worth in a single cruel glance. He had no idea those same hands had not only paid for every crystal glass in that room, but had also built the very world he was so proud to inhabit. This isn't just a story about a moment of disrespect. It's about what happens when a quiet man is pushed too far. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts on this story in the comments. Now let me take you back to that opulent ballroom, just before his own mother exposed a secret that left everyone speechless. Before that grand ballroom and its cold, judging eyes, my world was a much smaller, warmer place. It was a world that smelled of sawdust and wood glue. My workshop has always been my sanctuary, tucked behind the modest two-story house where I raised Sarah. It's not a fancy place. The air is thick, with the sweet, earthy scent of freshly cut oak and the sharp tang of varnish. Golden light slants through the two high windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust that dance like tiny spirits. Every tool has its place on the pegboard walls, their wooden handles worn smooth and dark from 30 years of use. My hands, the ones my son-in-law found so distasteful, knew each tool by feel alone. They could distinguish the heft of a Japanese pull saw from a standard tenon saw in complete darkness. Those hands built this life. After my wife Ellen passed away when Sarah was just 5, this workshop became both my refuge and my provider. I remember standing right here in this very spot, building Sarah's first crib from a beautiful piece of cherry wood. I sanded every edge until it was as smooth as riverstone, imagining her tiny fingers gripping the rails. I can still see her, a few years later, sitting on a stool in the corner, her small face smudged with sawdust, trying to help by hammering crooked nails into a scrap piece of pine. "I'm making a castle for my dolls, Daddy," she'd say, her voice full of serious purpose. Her laughter used to echo off these unfinished walls, a sound more beautiful than any symphony. Our house is connected to the workshop by a short, covered walkway. It's a simple home, filled not with expensive things, but with memories carved from wood. The dining table where we ate every meal was the first major project I completed for our family. Its surface is now a map of our history, marked with faint scratches from Sarah's science projects, and a small, dark ring from a coffee cup Ellen once left there. I've never had the heart to sand it down. In the living room, my old armchair sits by the window. It's a deep burgundy velvet, threadbare on the arms, and it is molded perfectly to the shape of my body over the years. That chair is where I read Sarah bedtime stories, where I helped her with homework, and where I waited up for her on the night of her first high school dance. My heart caught somewhere between pride and terror. My business, Miller & Finch Artisans, grew out of this workshop. My partner, Robert Finch, was the face of the company. He was brilliant with clients and marketing, a natural in a suit and tie. I was always the silent one, the craftsman behind the curtain. I preferred the quiet company of wood grain and the challenge of a complex joint. While Robert negotiated contracts in sleek boardrooms, I was here, covered in a fine layer of dust, bringing his designs to life. We built a reputation for quality that spread through the state. We furnished law offices, luxury homes, and boutique hotels. The money was good, better than most people would ever guess looking at my simple life, but it was never the point. The reward was in the work itself, in creating something lasting and beautiful with my own two hands. I remember the day Sarah brought Mark home for the first time. He was polished, confident, with a smile that seemed a little too practiced. He shook my hand, his grip firm, but his eyes scanned my living room with a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Disappointment, perhaps. He talked about his career in finance, about market trends and investment portfolios, words that felt foreign in my simple home. Sarah looked at him with such adoration, her eyes shining. And because she loved him, I tried to. I invited him into my workshop, showed him the pieces I was working on. He nodded politely, called my work a very nice hobby, and quickly changed the subject back to his latest stock acquisition. He saw the wood, but he couldn't see the stories within it. When they announced their engagement, Sarah showed me a magazine with a picture of Crestwood Manor. It was a palace of white marble and crystal, a fairy tale castle. "Isn't it a dream, Dad?" she'd whispered, her voice full of awe. I saw the price tag for a single day's rental and my heart skipped a beat. $32,000. That was just for the venue. The flowers, the catering, the string quartet, it all added up. The final estimate from the wedding planner was a staggering $150,000. Sarah's face fell as she looked at the numbers. "We can't," she said, her dream deflating. "It's impossible." I looked at my daughter, the same little girl who built doll castles out of scrap wood, and I saw the woman she had become. She deserved that fairy tale. The next day, I called Robert Finch. I told him I needed to liquidate a portion of my shares in the company. It was a significant piece of my retirement, my nest egg for the future. He tried to talk me out of it, but my mind was made up. On October 15th, the funds were transferred to my account. I never told Sarah where the money came from. I just told her not to worry. Her dream was safe. The 6 months leading up to the wedding were a slow, steady erosion of the world I thought I knew. The planning started at my dining table, the one with the coffee ring stain and the faint scratches from Sarah's childhood. She would arrive with binders and fabric swatches, her face glowing with excitement, while Mark trailed behind, his phone always pressed to his ear. He would end his calls with a sharp, "Execute the trade," and then slide into his chair, bringing a cold corporate air into my warm lived-in home. He'd glance around the room, a tight smile on his face, as if he were assessing a property for its flaws. He never said anything outright, but his eyes lingered on the threadbare arms of my old burgundy chair, on the worn spots in the hardwood floor. It was a quiet judgment, a constant, low hum of disapproval. The first real crack appeared during a discussion about the venue. Sarah had a list of beautiful rustic barns and historic inns. She showed us a picture of a place called Willow Creek Farm, with a great oak tree perfect for an outdoor ceremony. "It's so us, Dad, isn't it?" she said, her voice full of hope. Before I could answer, Mark cleared his throat. "It's charming, honey. Very rustic," he said, the word hanging in the air like an insult. "But my partners, my clients, they expect a certain standard. We need to project an image of success. Crestwood Manor is the only real option. It sends the right message." Sarah's face fell, but she quickly recovered, nodding in agreement. "Of course, you're right," she said. He wasn't talking about their message. He was talking about his. And the unspoken part was that my life, my home, this table, none of it sent the right message. Then came the conversations about money. They were always delicate, danced around. Mark would talk about his family's contributions in grand, vague terms. One evening, he spread a caterer's proposal on the table. The total was nearly $40,000. "My parents will, of course, handle this," he announced, looking at me with an expression that was meant to seem generous. "We don't want you to worry about a thing, David. You've done so much for Sarah already. Your focus should just be on walking her down the aisle." It sounded kind, but the subtext was clear. "Stay in your lane, old man. This is a league you can't afford to play in." I simply nodded, my hand resting on the checkbook in my pocket, the one I had used to wire the initial $75,000 deposit to the wedding planner just 2 days prior, on April 12th. I let him believe he was the provider, the one making it all happen. It was easier that way. It was for Sarah. The most personal slight came about a month before the wedding. We were at a final dress fitting for Sarah. Mark was there, looking impatient. He turned to me and said, "So, David, have you thought about your suit for the big day?" I told him I had a classic dark suit that was perfect for the occasion. Mark exchanged a look with his mother, who was also there. He put a hand on my shoulder, his touch feeling more like a restraint than a comfort. "I'm sure it's a wonderful suit," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But the photography at Crestwood is unforgiving. We've retained a top-tier photographer, and the aesthetic needs to be consistent. My tailor, Giovanni, can have something made for you. My treat, of course. We wouldn't want you to feel out of place." He was offering to dress me like a doll, to make sure the poor father-in-law didn't spoil his perfect pictures. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I looked at Sarah, hoping she would intervene, but she just smiled nervously and said, "That's so thoughtful of you, honey." That night, I couldn't sleep. I went out to my workshop, the smell of cedar and varnish a welcome comfort. I ran my hands over a half-finished rocking chair, the wood smooth and solid beneath my palms. These hands were the reason Sarah had a college education without a penny of debt. They were the reason she had a down payment for her first apartment. These same hands, which Mark saw as dirty and common, had built the very foundation he was so eager to stand upon and declare his own. I looked at a faded photo tacked to the wall. Sarah, age 7, holding up a lopsided birdhouse we built together, her grin missing 2 front teeth. Where had that girl gone? I saw her being reshaped, polished, and sanded down to fit into Mark's world, and a quiet, protective anger began to build inside me. But I pushed it down. For her, I would wear the suit. For her, I would play the part of the grateful, simple father. I would swallow my pride. I just hadn't realized then how much they were going to ask me to swallow. The wedding reception was a symphony of clinking crystal and polite laughter, a world away from the steady rhythm of my planer and the scent of pine. I stood near a marble pillar, watching Sarah dance with Mark under a chandelier that dripped light like frozen diamonds. She was radiant, her face a perfect picture of joy. For a moment, every doubt I had, every condescending glance from Mark over the past 6 months, simply melted away. This was for her. All of it. The $150,000 I had wired from my life's savings was a small price for that smile. I saw her glance over at me, her eyes bright, and I gave her a small, reassuring nod. My simple dark suit felt a little tight across the shoulders, and I felt a pang of longing for the familiar comfort of my workshop, for the worn velvet of my old burgundy armchair. But this was my duty and my joy to be here for her. My throat was dry, so I made my way toward the bar at the far end of the grand ballroom. The string quartet was playing something classical and light, a melody that seemed to float above the heads of the guests. As I passed a cluster of young men in identical tuxedos, I recognized them as Mark's groomsmen. They were laughing, holding their champagne flutes like trophies. Mark was in the center of the circle, his back partially to me. He was telling a story, his voice slick with the confidence of a man who had never known a day of real struggle. One of his friends, a boy with slick back hair, gestured with his glass in my general direction. "Hey, Mark, is that your new father-in-law? He looks a little overwhelmed." I stopped. I didn't mean to listen, but their voices carried in the cavernous room. I felt a knot of dread form in my stomach. Mark let out a short, dismissive laugh. It was a sound I had come to recognize. A sound that always came before a judgment. He took a slow sip of his champagne before answering, his voice loud enough for the whole group to hear clearly. "Don't mind him," he said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "That's Sarah's dad, a sweet old man but practically a charity case. Builds little tables or something in his garage." The groomsmen chuckled. Mark's smile widened, feeding off their amusement. "Honestly," he continued, turning just enough that I could see the smug curl of his lip, "I have no idea how he scraped enough together to even afford that suit. He looks more like a beggar who wandered in for a free meal." The laughter that followed was sharp, like breaking glass. The music from the string quartet seemed to warp and fade into a distant metallic hum. The air left my lungs in a silent rush, as if I'd been punched in the gut. Beggar. The word didn't just hang in the air. It shot through me, a shard of ice lodging itself deep in my chest. Every late night spent in the workshop, every splinter pulled from my fingers, every weekend sacrificed to meet a deadline, it all collapsed into that one ugly word. The memory of signing the wire transfer for the final wedding payment of $75,000 on September 2nd flashed in my mind. The bank teller had congratulated me, saying my daughter was a lucky woman. Now here I stood, a beggar in the palace I had paid for. I didn't say anything. I didn't confront them. My body moved on its own, turning away from the bar, away from the laughter, away from my daughter who was still blissfully dancing, unaware of the poison that had just been spilled. My feet carried me through a set of ornate glass doors and out onto a stone terrace. The cool night air was a shock, a welcome slap that brought the world back into sharp focus. The city lights glittered below, cold and distant. I looked down at my hands. The same hands Mark had just mocked. The calluses felt rough against my palms. I remembered Sarah as a little girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting on my lap in the burgundy armchair. She had taken my hand in hers, tracing the lines and scars with her tiny finger. "You have story hands, Daddy," she'd whispered. What story were they telling now? The story of a fool? A man who sold his future for a son-in-law who saw him as less than human? The bitterness rose in my throat, hot and acidic. I had let him into my home. I had let him sit at the table I built for my wife. I had stood by silently as he reshaped my daughter's dreams to fit his own ambitions. I had swallowed every insult, every condescending remark, all for the sake of her happiness. But this was different. This wasn't an insult to me. It was a desecration of my entire life's work, of my love for my child. The pain was immense, but as I stood there in the chilling night, it began to change. It cooled, hardened, and sharpened into something else entirely. It became clarity. I finally saw Mark not as a flawed man, but as a hollow one. The string quartet inside started a new song, but I couldn't hear it. The celebration was over. My daughter's fairy tale had just ended, at least for me. And in its place, a quiet, cold, and meticulously structured plan began to form. He called me a beggar. He was about to find out just how much this beggar was worth. I stood on that terrace for a long time, the distant city lights blurring into a cold, indifferent smear. The word, beggar, didn't echo in my mind. It settled. It found a home in the quiet space where my pride used to live, and it made itself comfortable. There was no explosion of rage. There was no desire to storm back inside and cause a scene. That would have been Mark's way, a loud, empty display of ego. My way has always been different. My work taught me patience. You can't rush the curing of wood, and you can't rush the careful dismantling of a man's world. The initial sting of his words, that sharp, gut-wrenching pain, began to recede. In its place, something cold and heavy took root. It was the calm that comes after the storm has passed, when you can finally see the full extent of the damage and begin to calculate the cost of repairs. I thought about the money, not in the way Mark thinks about it, as a tool for status and display, but as a physical representation of my life. I pictured the wire transfer confirmation slip from the bank, dated September 2nd, for the final payment of $75,000. I thought of the shares in Miller and Finch I had sold, shares that represented 30 years of my life, of sawdust in my lungs and varnish staining my skin. I had converted years into dollars, and I had handed it over so my daughter could have a dream. But the dream was a mirage. I had funded the construction of a beautiful cage, and my son-in-law was the proud zookeeper. He saw me not as the architect, but as an animal who had wandered onto the grounds. A switch flipped inside my head. It wasn't a loud click, but a quiet, definitive shift. The grief over my daughter's choice, the hurt from Mark's disrespect, it all coalesced into a single point of focus. It became a blueprint. My mind, so used to seeing the lines of a design, the joints, the stress points, began to see the structure of their life together. I saw the assets, the debts, the dependencies. I saw the foundation I had unknowingly provided, and I saw exactly where to place the charges to bring the whole hollow structure down without making a sound. I looked down at my hands again. Sarah was right. They were story hands. But Mark had just written a new, final chapter. These hands would no longer be building. They would be unbuilding. He thought he was laughing at a beggar. He had no idea he was mocking his own creditor. They were so busy looking at my simple suit, they never once thought to look at the ledger. They would never see this coming. The drive home from Crestwood Manor was silent. I didn't turn on the radio. I just listened to the hum of the tires on the asphalt. A steady, monotonous sound that was a welcome relief after the chaos of the reception. I didn't go back to the house. Instead, I pulled into the gravel driveway behind it and walked directly to my workshop. I flipped on the single overhead light, and the familiar scent of oak and varnish filled my lungs. clearing away the lingering smell of expensive perfume and regret. The room was cool and quiet. My tools hung in their perfect orderly rows. Nothing in here had changed. I ran my hand over the smooth, unfinished surface of a maple countertop I was building for a client. The wood was solid, honest. It was real. Unlike the world I had just left behind. I slept for maybe 2 hours in my old burgundy armchair, the one that still held the faint imprint of 1,000 bedtime stories. When the sun came up on Monday, October 18th, I didn't feel tired. I felt a strange and potent clarity. My first call was not to Sarah, but to my business partner, Robert Finch. He picked up on the second ring. "David, how was the wedding? You sound different." His voice was cheerful. I kept mine level. "Robert," I said, "I need you to buy out my remaining 25% stake in the company, effective immediately." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What? David? What happened? Is everything all right?" I didn't give him the details of the humiliation. I just gave him the facts. "I'm restructuring my finances. I'll have my lawyer draft the paperwork. I need the liquidation to be complete by the end of the fiscal quarter, December 31st. The valuation from our last audit was $2.2 million for the full company, so my remaining portion is $550,000. Robert started to protest, to ask more questions, but I cut him off gently. "It's not a negotiation, Robert. It's an instruction. Send everything to my lawyer." My lawyer was a man named Arthur Henderson, a sharp, no-nonsense man whose office we had furnished 10 years prior. At 11 a.m., I was sitting across from him in a chair I had built myself. I laid everything out on his polished mahogany desk. The wire transfer receipts for the $150,000 wedding payment. The documents from the sale of my initial shares. And finally, the most important document, Loan Agreement Number 743B, dated June 5th of the previous year. It was for the sum of $120,000, the full down payment for Sarah and Mark's luxury condominium downtown. "They think it was a gift, Arthur," I said, my voice calm. "I let them believe it was a gift. But you and I made sure the paperwork was ironclad." Arthur picked up the document, his eyes scanning the clauses we had so carefully constructed. "And here it is," he said, tapping a paragraph with his pen. Clause 7, Section C. "The loan is immediately callable, with the full principal and accrued 4.25% interest due within 90 days in the event of a material breach of the familial good faith agreement upon which this loan was predicated." Arthur looked at me over his glasses. "A material breach of good faith can be subjective, David." I leaned forward. "Calling your primary benefactor a beggar after he funded your entire life seems fairly material to me, wouldn't you agree? I have 3 of Mark's groomsmen who are willing to sign affidavits stating they heard the exchange. They reached out to me that very night, disgusted." Arthur's expression hardened. "That will be more than sufficient. What do you want to do?" My instructions were simple. "I want you to send a formal demand for payment. Give them the full 90 days, as stipulated. Payment in full of the principal, $120,000, plus the accrued interest of $7.225, for a total of $127.225. Payment due by January 20th of next year. No extensions, no payment plans. If they fail to pay, we begin foreclosure proceedings on January 21st. The call from Sarah came 2 days later, on Wednesday afternoon. I was in the workshop, sanding the edge of the maple countertop, the rhythmic motion soothing. Her name flashed on my phone screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Dad?" Her voice was a wreck, thick with tears. "Dad, we got a letter from your lawyer. It's a mistake, right? This is some kind of horrible mistake." I stopped sanding and set the tool down. "No, Sarah," I said, my voice even. "It's not a mistake. It's a business transaction." I could hear Mark yelling in the background, his voice a panicked, angry buzz. Sarah started sobbing. "But it was a gift. You said it was a gift for us, for our future." "I allowed you to believe it was a gift," I corrected her gently. "It was an interest-free loan, contingent on a foundation of mutual respect. That foundation has been broken. The terms of the agreement are now in effect. Please, Dad, we can't pay that. We don't have that kind of money. Mark will lose his job if his finances are in disarray. His company does background checks. You'll ruin us. Her plea was desperate, a raw nerve of fear and entitlement. I thought of her at 7, proudly holding that lopsided birdhouse. Then I thought of her standing by, smiling nervously, as Mark offered to buy me a suit so I wouldn't look out of place. The two images warred in my mind, but the second one was sharper, clearer. You have 88 days left to find a solution, I said, my voice devoid of the warmth she had known her entire life. I suggest you speak with your husband. He's the expert in finance after all. This is a business matter now, Sarah. I ended the call before she could reply. I picked up my sanding block again. The wood was patient. It didn't lie. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. And as the fine dust coated my hands, I felt a profound sense of peace. The plan was in motion. The first domino had fallen, and it had made a very satisfying sound. The weeks that followed were filled with a profound and heavy silence. The frantic, tearful phone call from Sarah was the last I heard from her directly. The autumn leaves turned from gold to a brittle brown, carpeting the yard in a rustling shroud. I spent my days in the workshop, the rhythmic scrape of a hand plane my only companion. The work was a meditation. Each perfect, paper-thin shaving that curled up from the wood was a small piece of chaos being smoothed into order. This was a world I could control. Outside these walls, the clock was ticking. The due date for the loan, January 20th, was a fixed point on the horizon, growing larger with each passing day. On November 15th, I met with Robert Finch for the last time as his business partner. We sat in the conference room of his downtown office, a room I had designed and furnished myself a decade ago. The long, solid walnut table between us was a piece I'd spent over 100 hours on, its surface so smooth it felt like still water. Robert slid the final buyout agreement across it. The numbers were stark and clear. A final payment of $550,000 for my remaining 25% share, which after capital gains taxes, would net me precisely $440,000. It was a fortune by any normal measure, yet it felt like a simple tool, a means to an end. "Are you sure about this, David?" Robert asked, his pen hovering over the signature line. 30 years. We built this from nothing. You can't just walk away. I looked at my old friend, at the worry etched into the lines around his eyes. I'm not walking away from the work, Robert. The work is in my hands. I'm just walking away from a partnership that no longer serves my life. I didn't owe him the ugly details, and he was wise enough not to press further. He signed, and I signed. The transfer was scheduled for December 28th, just before the end of the year. I walked out of that building feeling lighter than I had in months. I had shed the identity of the silent partner. I was simply David Miller again, a craftsman who now had a fully funded war chest. A week later, on November 22nd, an email arrived. It was from Sarah, but the language was stilted, formal. It was clearly written by Mark. The subject line was Family Reconciliation Proposal. It was a desperate, thinly veiled attempt to negotiate. The email spoke of misunderstandings and the stress of the wedding. It proposed a payment plan, $1,000 a month for the next 10 years and 7 months to cover the principal of the loan. It made no mention of the accrued interest. It was an offer that was both insulting and pathetic. They still didn't understand. This was never about the money. I forwarded the email to my lawyer, Arthur, with a single instruction: respond with a formal refusal. Arthur's reply to them was sent within the hour. It was a masterpiece of cold, legal precision. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, we are in receipt of your correspondence dated November 22nd. Please be advised that our client, Mr. David Miller, is not interested in a payment plan. The terms of loan agreement number 743B are non-negotiable. Payment in full of $127.225 is expected on or before the due date of January 20th. Failure to comply will result in the immediate initiation of foreclosure proceedings. Regards, Arthur Henderson, Esquire. With their last weak attempt at negotiation shut down, it was time for the second phase of my plan. Sarah's panicked words on the phone echoed in my mind. Mark will lose his job if his finances are in disarray. His company does background checks. I knew the name of the firm, Sterling Wentworth Capital. I remembered it because 5 years earlier, Miller and Finch had been commissioned to furnish their entire executive floor. I had personally overseen the installation of the Brazilian rosewood paneling in the CEO's office. I remembered the CEO, a man named Alistair Finch, no relation to Robert, who had shaken my hand, looked me in the eye, and said, "Mr. Miller, your work isn't just furniture. It's a statement of integrity." Integrity. The word tasted like irony. I didn't call Alistair Finch. That would have been a crude and obvious move. My plan was more elegant, more precise. On December 1st, I instructed Arthur to draft another letter. This one was not addressed to Mark and Sarah. It was addressed to the head of compliance at Sterling Wentworth Capital. The letter was carefully worded to be a simple, professional notification, devoid of any personal animosity. It stated that Mr. Mark Peterson, a senior portfolio manager at their firm, held a significant personal debt of $127,225 that was now 60 days into a 90-day call period and was on the verge of default. The letter went on to state that as Mr. Peterson was in a fiduciary role, managing millions of dollars of client assets, this level of personal financial distress could, by SEC guidelines, represent a significant conflict of interest and make him a potential risk for blackmail or compromise. It was all factual, it was all legal, it was a standard business communication, and it was a perfectly crafted torpedo aimed directly at the engine room of Mark's career. The letter was sent via certified mail on December 2nd. The delivery receipt was signed 3 days later. The first 2 weeks of December passed in quiet diligence. I finished the maple countertop, delivering it to a young family who were overjoyed with the result. Their gratitude was a balm to a wound I hadn't realized was still so raw. I began a new project, a small, intricately carved jewelry box made from cherry wood, the same wood I had used for Sarah's crib all those years ago. I didn't know who it was for, but my hands needed to build something beautiful again. In the evenings, I would sit in my burgundy armchair, not reading but simply listening to the house settle around me. The silence from Sarah and Mark was now absolute. I could almost feel their panic growing across the city, a frantic, silent scream. They were trapped. Their credit would be too damaged by the loan call to secure a new mortgage. And Mark's professional reputation was now under a microscope. He was no longer the master of the universe, executing trades with a flick of his wrist. He was a man with a secret, walking into his high-rise office every morning wondering which of his superiors knew. On the evening of December 18th, my phone rang. The number was not one I recognized. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. I said nothing, just listened. For a moment, there was only the sound of breathing on the other end. Then, a woman's voice, strained and hesitant, spoke my name. "David? David Miller? This is Evelyn Peterson, Mark's mother." I stood up from my armchair, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The final piece of the puzzle was about to click into place. "I think," she said, her voice trembling with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher, "you and I need to talk." If you liked this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life. We met 2 days later, on December 20th. I had suggested a neutral coffee shop downtown, but Evelyn was insistent. "No," she'd said, her voice firm. "This is a family matter. It needs to be handled in a family home. We'll come to you." I knew what that meant. It wasn't a request. It was a strategy. They wanted to be on my turf, to corner me among my own memories, thinking it would make me sentimental and weak. I agreed without hesitation. My home wasn't my weakness. It was my fortress, built of oak and memory, and they had no idea the kind of siege I was prepared for. When the doorbell rang at precisely 2 p.m., I wasn't surprised to see Mark standing behind his mother. His face was pale, a stark contrast to the expensive dark gray overcoat he wore. He looked thinner, The easy confidence he once wore like a second skin now frayed at the edges. He avoided my eyes, his gaze darting around my front porch as if looking for an escape route. Evelyn, on the other hand, looked directly at me, her expression a mixture of apology and grim determination. I stepped back and let them in, the familiar scent of my home, lemon oil and old wood, enveloping them. I led them into the living room. I sat in my burgundy armchair, the worn velvet a familiar comfort against my back. They took the sofa opposite me, the one where Sarah used to do her homework. Mark sat stiffly on the edge of the cushion, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. Evelyn sat back, her posture poised, but her eyes gave away her anxiety. "David," she began, her voice soft, "thank you for seeing us. We are here because this situation has escalated beyond what anyone intended." Before I could respond, Mark shot forward. "Intended? Mother, he sent a letter to my firm. He's trying to ruin me." His voice was a harsh, grating sound in the quiet room. He finally looked at me, his eyes burning with a desperate, cornered fury. "This has to stop. Now! You call off your lawyer, you tear up that ridiculous loan document, and you tell my compliance department this was all a misunderstanding. We can go back to how things were." I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. I looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of detached curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen. "Go back?" I asked, my voice calm and even. "There is no going back, Mark. There is only forward. And forward is a payment of $127,225 due in exactly 1 month." "This is insane," he spat, standing up and beginning to pace in front of the fireplace. "You're destroying your own daughter's life over a stupid comment. A joke!" "It was a joke at a wedding, for God's sake. You're going to make her homeless over a joke?" "Was it a joke, Mark?" I asked, my tone unchanged. Because from where I was standing, it sounded like an honest assessment of my worth. "You called me a beggar. A man who builds little tables in his garage. You seem to have a low opinion of my work. Yet you have no problem living in a home it paid for, driving a car it helped you buy, and launching a career built on a foundation of its earnings. There's a contradiction there I find interesting." His pacing stopped. He stared at me, his jaw working. Evelyn put a hand to her forehead. "Mark, please, sit down. This isn't helping." He ignored her. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Sitting there in your old man chair playing God with our lives." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "You're just a bitter old man. You're jealous. You're jealous that I can give Sarah a life you never could, a world away from this dusty relic of a house." He gestured around the room, his hand sweeping dismissively over the bookshelves I built, the photo of Ellen on the mantelpiece, the entire history of my life. That was his mistake. He had moved from attacking me to attacking my home, my past, my memory of my wife. The cold calm inside me sharpened to a fine point. "This house," I said, my voice still quiet, but now carrying a weight that made him flinch, "is paid for. Is yours?" The question hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. He had no answer. He had nothing but debt and a salary that was now under intense scrutiny. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of wealth, an illusion I had funded and was now systematically dismantling. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, he looked truly lost. Evelyn saw it too. She stood up, her face etched with a deep and profound sadness. "We should go, Mark." She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw not anger, but a weary resignation. She knew her son. She knew what he was. "David," she said quietly, "I'm sorry. For all of this." I gave a slight nod. My business was not with her. As they walked to the door, Mark turned back one last time, a final, desperate snarl on his face. "You'll regret this," he whispered. "Sarah will never forgive you." "Sarah will eventually have to decide what she values," I replied, not unkindly. "But that is a conversation for another day. You have 31 days left, Mark. I suggest you use them wisely." I closed the door behind them, the click of the lock echoing in the sudden silence. I walked back to my armchair and sat down, the house settling around me like a comforting blanket. He thought my love for my daughter was his shield. He was about to find out it was my sword. The day the loan was due, January 20th, dawned cold and gray. A thin layer of frost coated the windows of my workshop, blurring the world outside into a pale watercolor. I didn't look at the clock. I didn't need to. I felt the deadline in the quiet hum of the house, in the stillness of the winter air. I was putting the final coat of oil on the small cherry wood jewelry box, my hands moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm that had been my anchor for 30 years. The wood glowed under my touch, its grain a warm, intricate map. When the doorbell rang, its chime cutting through the silence, my hands didn't falter. I set the oilcloth down, wiped my palms on my apron, and walked through the covered walkway into the house. I knew this was the end of the story. Sarah was standing on the porch, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Mark stood beside her, a ghost of the man who had laughed in the grand ballroom of Crestwood Manor. His expensive wool coat hung on him like it was a size too big, and a muscle twitched uncontrollably in his jaw. They looked like shipwreck survivors who had finally washed ashore. I opened the door wide and stepped back, saying nothing. They walked into the living room, the space where I had read Sarah bedtime stories, and it felt as if they were tracking mud and seawater onto a sacred floor. I took my seat in the burgundy armchair. It was my throne, my command center. They remained standing, a silent, desperate tableau in the middle of the room. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice a ragged whisper. "Dad, please, it's today. We couldn't get the money. The foreclosure notice, it's going to be filed tomorrow. You can't do this to us, to me." Mark finally erupted, the last vestiges of his composure shattering like cheap glass. "Us? He's been doing this to asterisk me. You planned this from the beginning," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You set me up. This was never about a loan. It was about your pathetic jealousy. You couldn't stand that I could give her a better life than you ever could, so you decided to burn it all down." I let his words, hot and useless, dissipate into the cool air of the room. I looked at him, my expression unchanging. "The only thing I planned, Mark, was for my daughter to have a good start in her life. The home, the wedding, it was all for her. You were just an unfortunate accessory she chose to bring along." I leaned forward slightly in my chair. "You think this is about jealousy? This is about an audit. I saw a bad investment, and I liquidated my position. You were a bad investment." He laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "You're a carpenter. What do you know about investments?" "I know enough," I said calmly. "I know that Alistair Finch, the CEO of your firm, values integrity above all else. I know this because he told me so himself, standing right here in this room, after I delivered the custom rosewood desk he now uses. I didn't have to ruin your career, Mark. I just sent a professional notification of your impending loan default. Your company's compliance department did the rest. It turns out they don't like it when their senior portfolio managers who control millions in client funds are financially compromised. You were a risk they were unwilling to take." The color drained from his face. He finally understood that the letter to his firm wasn't a random act of spite. It was a surgical strike, delivered with an insider's knowledge. He stumbled back a step, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Sarah was openly sobbing now, her hands covering her face. "Why? Dad, why are you being so cruel?" I turned my gaze to her, my heart aching with a sorrow so deep it felt ancient. "Cruel? Sarah, I gave you everything. I sold a piece of my soul to pay for that wedding. I stood by while he belittled my home, my life, my hands. And I would have swallowed it all, for you. But when he stood in that ballroom, surrounded by the luxury I had provided, and called me a beggar, that was the moment the debt came due. It was a joke." Mark croaked, his voice desperate. "Then here's another one," I said, my eyes locking onto his. "Let's talk about your education, Wharton School of Business." "Very impressive. You got in on the Evelyn Miller Memorial Scholarship, didn't you? A full ride." He just stared at me, confused. How could you possibly know that?" I let the silence stretch, letting him dangle on the hook of his own ignorance. "My wife's name," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, "was Ellen Miller. But her mother, your grandmother Sarah, was Evelyn. I started that scholarship fund 20 years ago in her memory. I wanted to do some good in the world with the money my hands had made. I paused, letting the final, crushing weight of the truth settle. The foundation I established signed every one of your tuition checks, Mark. All 4 years of them. A total of $240,000. The beggar you laughed at in the ballroom is the same man who paid for the education that gave you your arrogance. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than stone. Mark looked as if he had been physically struck, his body swaying slightly. The entire edifice of his life, his pride, his sense of self-worth, had been built on a foundation of my quiet generosity, and he had spent months spitting on it. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a horror that was almost beautiful to watch. He wasn't just a fraud, he was the punchline to a cosmic joke he had never understood. Sarah lowered her hands from her face, her eyes moving from me to her husband. In that moment, she saw it all. She saw the truth, stark and ugly. The man she married wasn't just cruel. He was a hollow shell, propped up by the very man he despised. "The foreclosure notice will be filed at 9 a.m. tomorrow," I said, standing up from my chair. My voice was steady, devoid of triumph. It was simply a statement of fact. You have until the end of the month to vacate. "Sarah," I said, speaking only to her now, "what you do from here is your choice." I turned my back on them and walked to my workshop, closing the door behind me. The solid click of the latch was the final word. The weeks following that final confrontation were the quietest I had known in a long time. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, settling back into its old, comfortable rhythms. The foreclosure on the condominium proceeded exactly as planned. The property was listed by the bank on February 15th. Mark vanished from our lives as completely as if he had never existed. I heard through the grapevine that he lost his position at Sterling Wentworth and had moved back in with his parents, his world reduced to the 4 walls of his childhood bedroom. I felt no satisfaction in this, only a distant, clinical sense of an equation being solved. My focus was on my own life, on the new, uncluttered space that had opened up before me. I spent my days in the workshop, not driven by deadlines or financial need, but by a simple, rediscovered joy in the work itself. I was no longer the silent partner, the secret benefactor, or the beggar in the corner. I was just a craftsman, and my hands were my own again. About a month later, Sarah came to my door. She was alone. She didn't ring the bell, just knocked softly, a sound so different from the frantic pounding of her previous visits. When I opened the door, I saw a woman I hadn't seen in years. The polished veneer Mark had so carefully applied was gone. She was wearing simple jeans and a sweater, her hair was pulled back, and her eyes, though still carrying a shadow of sadness, were clear. She didn't try to make excuses or offer a flood of apologies. She just stood there on the porch and said, "Can I come home, Dad?" It was a question, not a demand. It was the voice of the little girl who used to build lopsided birdhouses, asking for entry into the world she had so carelessly left behind. I simply nodded and stepped aside, letting her in. We didn't talk for a long time. She made us tea, moving around my kitchen with a familiar, hesitant grace. We sat at the dining table, the one with the coffee ring stain, and the history of our lives etched into its surface. I went to my workshop and came back with a small jewelry box I had finished, the one made from the same cherry wood as her crib. I slid it across the table to her. Her fingers trembled as she traced the intricate carvings on the lid. "I built this without knowing who it was for," I told her. "I just knew I needed to make something beautiful again. I think it's for you, for the new things you'll collect, the new memories you'll make." She opened the lid, and the empty, velvet-lined interior seemed to represent a future waiting to be written. She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes, but they were not the tears of panic or desperation I had seen before. They were tears of understanding. She reached across the table and took my hand in hers, turning it over to look at the palm, just as she had done as a child. She traced the calluses, the old scars, the network of lines that told the story of my life. "Story hands," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I finally understand the stories, Dad. I'm so sorry I stopped listening to them." In that moment, the wound between us didn't magically heal, but I knew it had finally begun to close. The life I had built wasn't destroyed. It was just waiting for its rightful heir to return and appreciate its true value. My home was a home again, not just a house. And my hands, once a source of shame in the eyes of a stranger, were once again what they had always been: a father's hands, strong and capable, ready to build the future. It's funny how a life storm can make you see your own home more clearly. With Sarah back, the house feels like itself again. The scent of cherry wood from the little jewelry box on her nightstand is a quiet promise of a new chapter, one built on truth, not illusion. My hands are busy again, not with the cold calculus of dismantling a life, but with the familiar joy of creation. They tell stories, just as she said all those years ago. But I've learned that the most important story they tell is not for others, but for myself. It's a story of integrity. The world is full of people like Mark, people captivated by the shine on the surface. They mistake debt for wealth, arrogance for confidence, and silence for weakness. But they forget that everything of real value, a family, a home, a life of purpose, is built from the ground up, with patience and honest work. It isn't loud or flashy. It's solid. And when the storm comes, it's the only thing that remains standing. True strength isn't about the suit you wear or the title you hold. It's about knowing what your hands can build and what they stand for. Dignity is a quiet fortress, and self-respect is the only currency that never loses its value. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life.